Okay.
The puppy fit or to keep?
We are live. Yeah, no, to keep actually this opportunity to have a puppy. So for those of you who don't know me personally, I have this crazy wild dog named Chester, we've had for about a year now. Actually, we got him in March of last year. And he's got a lot of energy, which is totally fine. But lately he's been really getting feisty with Nola, who's almost 14. And it's not in like a bad, he's not aggressive. He just wants to play. So Marcus and I have talked a lot about getting a puppy, and we were going to wait until Nola passed away, but now he won't leave her alone. And I felt really bad because poor Nola, like she's 14, you know, she can't have this puppy, or he's not a puppy, but jumping on her all the time. So we're like, well, maybe we'll get a puppy. And then my brother's amazing girlfriend came across free puppies. So we're going to get a puppy. I know. And it was really fast. It was like, hey, we have a puppy. Do you want a puppy? And I thought for sure I'd never convince Marcus. But I think because Marcus sees the stress that it's putting on Nala, he's like, okay, well, I mean, if this puppy is going to distract the other dog and leave Nala in peace, you know, like, Nala's old. She just wants her golden years and be left alone. So anyway, so we're expecting a puppy tonight, which is really, really exciting.
That is exciting.
Yeah, I cannot wait to meet her. I think she's maybe not even 10. She'll be 10 weeks maybe.
Puppy.
Like puppy, which is totally against every fiber in my being, right? Like I didn't want to commit, because puppies are more work than little babies are. Like I feel like puppies are more work than newborns.
I agree.
When opportunity strikes, what are you supposed to do, you know? So we'll see. And it'll be good because I'll have to train the puppy, which means I'll get more training in with Chester too, because he needs some training. And we started out so strong with him, and then life happened and I got frustrated, and here we are. So it'll be good. Yes, and I also apologize for those in the audience who are hearing me right now because I sound sick. I am not sick. I actually feel very well. I just had a very long weekend full of sporting events, and I am a hooter and a hollerer for all of my children. And so between all of the soccers and all of the BMXs and all of the things, I lost my voice. And so here we are. So no, I am not sick. I feel great. Actually, I just, I get overexcited. So here we are. I did, as I was putting together the presentations, I have all of my notes here in my handed-down notebook. So I was prepared, but I didn't have the opportunity to finish the presentation part of it. So we're just going to go off the cuff, and I'm going to talk about all of the things about carbs. I was interrupted with, well, first of all, I had an onslaught of student emails that I had to attend to today. Today is the first day of finals, so they're all kind of in panic mode. So that took up a large portion of my day. And then I also got a call home from the school and had to deal with a matter with my oldest. So that was fun. So it's been a good Monday is what I'm trying to say. Oh, well, it is what it is. Let's talk carbs. Okay, so carbs. I'm really, really excited about this topic because right now carbs is kind of in the spotlight as being like really bad, and we should cut out all the carbs, and they're not necessary, and they're getting this terrible reputation in very much the same manner that fat got a bad reputation in decades prior. And I'm really, really hoping, first of all, that I can convince you today that not all carbs are bad and carbs are not created equal, so that we can stop fearing the carb. And two, I'm really hoping that just like we look back on our low fat days in nutrition, that terrible part of our nutritional history where we're like low fat everything, and now we look back and go, oh, whoops, that was a mistake. I'm really hoping that we start turning the corner and start accepting carbs again. I really hope that this becomes a period in our nutritional history where we go, oh, whoops, we maybe shouldn't have demonized all those carbs too. So let's talk about carbs and what they are and what they're used for and who needs them and who doesn't, and why we should stop demonizing this entire food group. It's definitely the running right now, right? For like, these are the worst things that you could ever consume, which is it's just not true. So like I said, my presentation wasn't completed, so we're just going to talk about it. But as always, you guys are welcome to jump in. I'm trying to keep an eye on the comments here on my phone. So if I'm looking off to the side, that's me checking Facebook to make sure that I'm not missing you guys. But let's start. Plainly put, carbs are just sugar molecules. All carbs are just sugar molecules that have been bonded in different ways and have been put together in different structures. But at the end of the day, they're all made of 6 carbon, 12 hydrogen, 6 oxygen, and they're just bonded in different ways. They come in 3 different forms. We've got our starches, our fibers, and our simple sugars. They're all the same structure. And our bodies are always building these things up, and they're always breaking them down for energy. They're one of the biggest energy sources that our body has, that and fat and protein. So before I jump into this, I do want to point out that carbs are 100% non-essential for humans. What does that mean? It means that we can survive just fine without ever eating them in our diet. Hey, there are 3 macronutrients. We have proteins and fats. Those are absolutely essential. We have to eat those in order to survive. We have to get those in our diets in order for it to function, to live. And the 3rd macronutrient is a carb. And carbs are actually non-essential. They are one of the 3 big nutrients that give us energy and that fuel us. And yet they're also the one macronutrient that we could totally survive without and never need. So in terms of who needs carbs, the answer there is nobody. No human needs carbs. It's not essential. Now, I want to point out that even though we don't need them, that's not the same as saying that we can operate optimally without them, okay? That's the difference. So we can be fine without them and we can survive, but we can't necessarily reach our optimal health without them. Okay, so, and there are reasons why we have developed in this way. We have been hunters. That's our evolutionary history. And so when you go and you hunt animals store what, right? They're made of protein and fats. So regardless of our situation throughout our evolutionary history, we were always able to obtain proteins and fats. Okay, and then when we could get carbs in the forms of fruits and vegetables, we would consume those too. We are omnivores. So our bodies can handle carbs. They can flourish off carbs. They prefer carbs for energy. It's the first thing they use for energy, but they are not essential. So I want to be clear that even though they're not essential, that doesn't mean that we should cut them all out and still feel our optimal health, because that's not quite the way that we were designed. We were designed to survive without them, because they were more scarce throughout our evolutionary history. But that's not to say that we feel the best without them, okay? So I will get eventually into like who or what kind of person would function better with more carbs in their diets, right? There are definitely populations of people who need more of them to sustain more energy levels and to operate better. And there are populations who really don't eat a whole lot of carbs, okay? But whether or not you're one of those people who does or does not flourish on more carbs, it really depends on 3 main factors. It depends on your current state of health. So where are you metabolically right now? It depends on your lifestyle. What sort of life do you live? High stress, low stress, lots of movement, lots of power, lots of endurance, right? Are you sedentary? So where you are now with health, what your current lifestyle is, and genetics. Genetics play a role. Hey, some of us can tolerate higher carbs because that's how we're genetically built, and some of us can't, right? It's the same thing, like some of us are lactose intolerant and some of us aren't. That's a gene, okay? So, so whether or not carbs are right for you really depends on where you are currently with your health and also what your lifestyle is. And this can change. Maybe you're in a place in your life right now where carbs are not necessarily supportive of your health goals. And then you change something about your lifestyle, and you change something about your health, and then you turn into a person who actually flourishes off carbs. It's very fluid. Okay, it's not this black and white thing where no carbs ever, period. That's just not the way that we're designed. And we really need to like step away from this whole black and white idea of nutrition, because this is just not the way that our body, we're complex creatures. Okay, so carbs start very simply as 1-ring structures. They come in, they're monosaccharides, quite literally 1 sugar is what monosaccharides means. The 3 ones that most people are, these are not the only 3 main ones, but they're the ones that most people know. And that's glucose, fructose, and galactose, okay? And then those simple sugars, those one ring sugars, which all again share the same kind of chemical structure. They're just bonded in different ways, so they have slightly different structures. But those start bonding together to make bigger saccharides, disaccharides, and oligosaccharides and polysaccharides and so on. So they can bond together in pairs, which are disaccharides. And so like things like glucose and fructose bond together, and that makes table sugar, that's sucrose, right? Or galactose and glucose bond together, and that makes lactose, right? Which is the sugar that we find in dairy. And then once they start bonding, they can start bonding in different ways. And the more they start bonding, they get these more complex structures. But at the end of the day, all carbs come down to our single sugar molecules that have been bonded in different ways. When we start putting long chains of glucose together, that's when we start making things like starches. Okay, so that's our potatoes and our rices. And those come in different forms too. You've got your starches that are harder to digest, and you have your starches that are a lot easier to digest, and those come in forms of amylose and amylopectin. But this is all very scientific, and it probably doesn't matter to you, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to these single sugars that are all just bonded in different ways, and that's how our body uses them in different ways. So we've got starches, fibers, and then our simple sugars. So starches are just, like I said, they're just long chains of glucose. Okay, glucose is our main fuel carb, right? That's the thing that provides fuel for our cells and for our brain. It's what gets stored in our muscle to fuel our muscles. Okay, it's what gets stored in our liver for our liver to release energy when we need it. And then they get strung all together and they create complex structures that our body then has to break apart. They have to break those bonds. And then, so starches are like big things of sugars just all stuck together. And then when we eat the starches, our body has to break those bonds to release those glucose so that we can absorb them and use the energy as necessary. Fibers are sugar molecules that have been bonded in a way that we can't break them. That's why they're indigestible. Okay, we can't actually absorb them. We can't use fiber for energy. Okay, we can use the sugars, and we can use the starches for energy. But the fiber, which are the same thing, they're just bonded. It's called a beta bond, and we don't have the enzymes necessary within our bodies to break those apart. And if we can't break the bonds, then we can't use those individual sugars for energy. Okay, so fiber isn't actually used as an energy source, but it is used for other things. It's really important for our gut health. It really helps with motility, so bowel movements. There's insoluble and soluble fiber, and I won't go into that, but at the end of the day, fiber is a carb that we can't digest and get energy from, but it does give us other health benefits. So they're not useless, they're just not useful for energy. Okay. Now, carbs come in also different forms known as simple and complex, right? Simple is exactly what they sound like. They're the mono and disaccharides. They're really easily digested by our body. Okay, they're either immediately ready for use to be taken up into the bloodstream or go straight to the liver, or they are easily broken, like sucrose, which I told you was glucose and fructose, right? The bond there is really easy for our bodies to break apart, so then it can start using those individual, basically energy capsules, right? That's what we're doing. So we've got the simple carbs, and then we have the complex ones. And those are the ones where we've got lots of different sugar molecules built up in different structures. You've got the linear ones, which is the amylose. You've got the ones that are branched, they look like trees, and those are amylopectin, and those are easily broken too. Those bonds are really easily broken. And amylopectin is more easily broken than an amylose, which is one of the reasons why we can get like huge sugar spikes after we eat potatoes, for example. Let's see, I'm getting notifications here that don't make me happy. Hopefully I haven't lost you guys. Okay. Oh man. So these simple ones, these are the ones that typically are associated with like spikes in our blood sugar. Okay, simple sugars. They're easily digestible. And the complex ones, and I'll go into a list of like complex versus simple. The complex ones are ones that are slower to digest. They take our body a little bit longer to break apart. They have a slower impact on our blood sugar. They're not typically associated with huge spikes. They help regulate. Okay, but you have to be really careful here because simple sugars are not all bad, and complex carbs are not all good. So we have to be very careful with trying to label, like, again, we shouldn't be labeling entire groups as bad or good. They have their different uses and their different purposes, and we just have to figure out what we need in order to fuel what we do with our lives. So like simple sugars include things like your table sugars, your candies, your pastries, your, the juices and the sodas. But simple sugars also include things like honey and milk, right? Milk is a simple sugar. It's got the lactose in it, which is just a disaccharide. Okay, so it's considered a simple carb, and yet milk is not bad for us, right? So you have to be a little bit careful with how we label these. And then complex carbs, those are things like your fruits and your veggies and your whole grains, your quinoas, beans and lentils. Sorry, looking at my notes at my list here. Right, and typically these complex carbs are associated with better regulation of blood sugars. But again, it's not black and white. It's not always, because like white potatoes, white rice, breads, pasta, those are also considered complex carbs, but they're starchy. And since they're starchy, remember, starches are just long chains of glucose bonded together that are really, really easy for our body to break up. So even though they're considered complex carbs, we break them up really, really fast, and then they create this spike in our blood sugars. So not all simple sugars are bad, and not all complex ones are good. So just be careful with trying to label things in their entirety as good or bad. That's just not the way it works, and they have different uses for different reasons. Okay. But at the end of the day, all of our carbs are broken down into single sugar molecules to be used as energy if it can be. Like in the case of fiber, we can't break those bonds, and so those are not used as energy. Now, once they're broken down into the simple sugars, your liver stores some, your muscles take some, and some of it's sent out for your cells, because your cells use this in order to do its cellular respiration and all of that fun jazz too. And then what our body doesn't deem necessary right then, it converts into fat, and it stores as fat. So humans are actually not great at storing carbs. That's not what we do. We store things like fat and a little bit of protein. Plants store things as carbs, right? Plants are carbs. So we have this amazing symbiotic relationship with plants where we like breathe out carbon and they take it in to fuel themselves. And then they're built of carbs, they're carb storage, and we are built of fats and proteins. So we have this like amazing relationship with plants. So we just don't store carbs very well. So if we have an excess of carbs that our body doesn't deem necessary, it has to figure out what to do with it somehow. So what it does is just takes all the extra energy and it says, well, I guess I'll just use you for later, right? And it converts it to fat, and that's when we get some fat storage if we consume too many. Now, that's not to say that carbs are bad, right? Our body stores all of its excess energy as fat. So if we're eating too much protein, even, it can store it as fat. If we're eating too much fat, it can store it as fat. If we're eating too many carbs, it stores it as fat. That's what we do. We're fat storing machines. Plants are carb storing machines. Okay? That's kind of the beautiful relationship that we have with nature. So here's the thing, like, let's talk about healthy carbs, okay? Not all carbs are created equal. And I know I don't need to tell you that. Like, we know that the carbs that we get from broccoli, because broccoli's, right? It's a plant. If it's a plant, it's got some, plants are carbs, right? That's what they're stored thing. They're stored sugar. So, but we know that the carbs that we get from broccoli is not at all the same as the carbs that we're getting from a donut, right? I don't have to tell you that carbs are not created equal, just like I don't have to tell you that fats are not created equal, and I don't have to tell you that proteins are not created equal. So these different forms, starches, sugars, and fibers, they impact the way our body operates. Like, spikes in our blood sugar are generally frowned upon, right? We don't want spikes in our blood sugar. We don't want blood sugar irregulation. And so we want to kind of carefully monitor the way that these foods impact our blood sugars after we consume them. And there's a couple different measures to do it. I'm going to mainly talk about the glycemic index. Even though I fully recognize and am aware that there are some issues with the glycemic index, which I will address here in just a minute. But the glycemic index is one of the ways that we can measure how foods impact our blood sugar after we consume them, okay? It's a measure, it's a comparison, the glycemic index. It's how much 50 grams of this certain carbohydrate, how does that impact your blood sugar compared to 50 grams of pure glucose? And remember what glucose is that's the simplest form of the sugar that we can use for energy, okay? That's glucose is what our liver stores for backup energy. That's what comes together to create glycogen that fills our muscles. Hey, glucose is our kind of our main form of like sugar, use. So what the glycemic index does is it compares 50 grams of whatever food it is that you're eating. How does that impact your blood compared to 50 grams of pure glucose? So if a food has a glycemic index of 100, then that means it impacts your blood at the exact same way that 50 grams of pure glucose does, okay? So 100 is like the measure. If you're below 100, then it impacts less than pure glucose. And if you're above 100, it actually impacts your blood sugar more than pure glucose. So the lower the score, your glycemic index, the lower the impact on your blood sugar. And just to give you some ideas, I wrote some down here to give you some ideas of what some of the glycemic impacts are of some foods. Now, I wanted to point out that there are definitely some issues with this measure. Okay, one, glycemic index only measures the impact that it has on your blood sugar, and it doesn't measure like other hormone issues. It doesn't measure the impact that it has on livers. So for example, fructose doesn't typically hit our blood. Fructose is prioritized by the liver. So you can eat something that's really high in fructose like juice, okay, and not see a huge spike in your blood sugar, but that doesn't mean that juice is good for you, because since you're slamming your system with fructose, it puts your liver into overdrive because it has to deal with that fructose, since the rest of our body can't use fructose, only the liver can. And so when we start slamming our body with fructose, even though it's got a low glycemic index, we can still create problems with our liver, like fatty liver disease. Okay, so there are issues with it. The other thing is that it's a 50-gram comparison. And I know most of us don't really have a great idea like what 50 grams looks like, but for example, to get 50 grams of carrots compared to getting 50 grams of carbs out of carrots versus 50 grams of carbs out of a candy bar, you'd have to eat like 3 or 4 cups of carrots versus like 1 candy bar, right? So it's it doesn't take portions like into consideration at all, because most people aren't sitting down and eating 4 cups of carrots, but a lot of people are sitting down and eating an entire candy bar, right? So you have to be a little bit careful with the glycemic index, but just so you get some idea of like what some of these foods are doing to our blood sugar, the glycemic index of peas, which is a starchy vegetable, 51, okay? So about half, it impacts your blood sugar, about half as much as pure glucose was. Carrots has a glycemic index of 35. A baked white potato, like a russet potato, 111, which means that baked russet potatoes, impact your blood sugar even more than pure glucose. Okay, that's a little bit crazy to think about. Apples, 40, cherries, 22, milk, 31, asparagus, 15, sweet potatoes, 54. So that's interesting too, like white potatoes, 111. So it's impacting your blood sugar even more, right, than glucose does. But sweet potatoes, it's only 54. So it's half as much as glucose, right? So these are, and white rice is at 72, white bread is at 100. Right, which means when you're consuming white bread, you're impacting your blood sugar just like you would be just eating pure glucose on its own. And so it's just kind of good to know, like, especially if you're somebody who's trying to watch your blood sugars, if you're somebody who's pre-diabetic or diabetic, or if you've got metabolic syndrome and you're worried about blood sugar levels, knowing the glycemic index of foods can be helpful, because it can kind of guide you into which carbs are going to be right for your body. Okay. Now, if you're a normally functioning human being and you're not dealing with metabolic syndrome, you're not dealing with like blood sugar dysregulation, then having high glycemic indexed foods sometimes doesn't typically cause issues. Okay. Where we start causing problems for ourselves is when we start consuming these high glycemic index foods often, right? Like not just occasionally, but all of the time. And we start stacking them, right? It's like when we get up and we do a hit with our, like we get up and we hit our blood sugar with our like pastry and our, vanilla latte. And then at lunch, we decide to have a, a bagel and cream cheese. And then at dinner, we have a giant bowl of pasta, right? It's just hit after hit after hit. And we get this sustained like rise in blood sugar. And that's when we start creating problems for ourselves. But if we're a little bit more careful with the types of foods that we're choosing throughout the day, and we're creating a better balance for our bodies, then consuming things like that on occasion is totally fine. Like it's fine if you want to have your, scone in the morning, but then pair it with something that also has like a protein and a fat to it, right? Like have like eggs in a scone, and then maybe make a different choice for lunch besides a bagel because you already had a scone, right? So it's not that all of these foods are off limits. It's that you have to be a little bit more intentional about what you're pairing them with, right? So that we're not creating this hit on our blood sugar one after another, after another, after another, which is causing things like, diabetes and metabolic syndrome. Okay. Now, why are carbs important? Because I said that they're not essential, which is true. They're not essential. So if they're not essential, why do we need them at all? Well, again, we'll talk about the kind of people who really should be more attentive to their carb intake and the type of people who could probably cut out most of that and be totally fine. But we have 3 energy systems, and I don't want to go into too much detail because I really don't want this one to take too long. I'm trying to be more conscientious about time. You guys, I always thought that they would be like half hours, and they always extend to more than an hour, but I'm a bit of a, I tend to ramble. So I apologize for that. But we have 3 different energy systems, and understanding what they do and how they're driven is really important to the way that you should be setting up your nutrition. Okay, so we've got the first one is the ATP PCR system. And this is the thing that kicks into drive when you start doing activity, like intense activity, things like sprinting or lifting really heavy or, doing a quick golf swing, or like this is like max effort energy. So this is the system that pops in for like the first 10 seconds of intense activity. Okay, and that system is fueled mainly by carbs. Right. So if you're somebody who does a lot of intense activity, who does things like sprints, does things like lifting max weights, does things like baseball where you're sprinting, or basketball when you got fast breakaways, tennis, golfing, I think I said golfing. Anyway, if you're somebody who partakes in those types of activities, you're going to want carbs in your diet because that is what's fueling that quick drive, that quick intense energy. After the first 10 seconds, that ATP is all used up. Now, ATP is that energy system actually replenishes after about 2 or 3 minutes, which is why if you've ever gone through a program where you're doing max lifts, they tell you to do your max lift. It's a max effort and then wait about 90 seconds where you're giving your energy time to replenish. So that system does replenish after about 2 or 3 minutes. But if you're still going, if you're still trying to need energy, like let's say that you started sprinting and then you keep on running. So things that take a little bit more time, up to about 90 seconds, 2 minutes, things like 400-meter dashes. If you're like lifting, 10 reps instead of just 1 max, interval training, anything like that, that's the glycolytic energy system. Okay, so that starts kicking in, and that gives you a little bit longer of a slightly less intense energy burst of energy. So the first one is a very intense maximal effort that's fueled by carbs, but it only lasts a few seconds. Your second energy system is also fueled by carbs. It gives you a little bit longer of less intense, right, like interval training. And then if you're still trying to go, right, like so let's say you sprint and then you keep on running, but at a decent pace. So your glycolytic system has popped in, and then you just keep on going. So now you're running for endurance. Okay, that switches into this oxidative pathway. And that's more endurance, that's slow twitch muscles, that's kind of this longevity type thing. And that's like lower intensity. That pathway is fueled by fat. Okay, most of our energy there is coming from fat sources, whereas the first 2 are coming from carb sources. So if you're one who partakes in like aerobic activities, that's an oxidative pathway. That's actually mostly fueled by fat until you reach the capacity of your oxidative pathway, and then you switch back to carbs. But for most of us, we don't tend to do that. So, but people like marathon runners, for example, they reach their oxidative capacity, and then they have to switch back to carbs. But for most of us, our endurance type activities, just like walking, hiking, long runs, these sorts of activities, long swims, these are oxidative pathways. These are fueled by fat. Okay. So if you're anaerobic, things that need like strength, sprints, bursts of energy, that's the ATP and glycolytic. That's carb fueled. Okay. If you're doing aerobics, where you're doing sustained movement for long periods of time, that's oxidative, that's fat fueled. Why do you care? Because if you are a person who likes to train with bursts of energy or sprints or intervals like that, you are somebody who would benefit from more carbs in your diet, okay? Because that is what's fueling your system, your energy system. Now, these are not separate systems. I want to be clear. It's not like this, then this, then this. They're running simultaneously. Just the oxidative pathway is the longest one to get running. So it starts to go while the ATP is going. So it's like initial energy, intermediate energy, long-term energy. Okay, so these are kind of all running together, supporting one another to fuel your needs. But if you're somebody who's doing quick movements, fast twitch movements, things, most sports, these sorts of things are most like traditional sports like baseball and football and basketball, soccer, these sorts of things, those are running off carb fueled systems. Okay? But if you're doing endurance, long swims, long runs, hikes, walks, those are running on an oxidative, that's fat fueled sources. So you need to adapt your nutrition to your lifestyle. Okay, so how are you moving? You should, how am I moving? If I'm doing fast twitch movements, then I should probably up my carbs. The other thing to say about that is that carbs are essential for recovery. And I shouldn't say essential, but they're important for recovery. Carbs are that when you use a lot of energy and you deplete your muscles of that glycogen, they want to restore that energy. Okay, so if you want to do quicker recovery so that you can get up and not feel as sore, or you want to get up and do it again, for example, you want to replenish that energy, and the quickest way to do that is to get a healthy carb in. Right, so that's why I say, like, and that's true if you're doing endurance or if you're doing fast twitch. Okay, you do want to replenish it. So even if you're one who does more endurance, you still do want to consume a moderate amount of carbs to help replenish the glycogen stores in your muscles after you perform your activity. Okay, so after an intense amount of physical energy, you want to replenish it. So it's really important with our recovery. The other thing that I wanted to say, did I talk about stress here? I did. Okay. Carbs also contribute to our hormone profiles. So this is the other thing, is like, if you consume too few carbs for your lifestyle, you can wreak havoc on your hormones. And if you consume too many carbs for your lifestyle, you can wreak havoc on your hormones. There's the sweet spot in between. Okay? So if you're, for example, stress, right? If you live a high stress life, and that could be physical and mental or a combination of both, we know that cortisol is our stress hormone. That's what's released. Now, cortisol is catabolic, which means it breaks things down, including muscle. Okay? It breaks tissue down. One thing that offsets cortisol, that kind of turns off that cortisol and helps your body recover after it's been hit with a bout of stress, again, whether that be physical in terms of exercise or whether that be some sort of mental stress, psychological stress. One thing that helps turn off that cortisol is insulin, and insulin is triggered by carb consumption. So if you're somebody who leads a very stressful life, you will benefit from eating healthy carbs. It will help you with your hormone profile. So if you are a high stress individual who also moves your body a lot and are consuming very little carbs, you are not doing yourself any favors at all. Your body's probably all sorts of out of whack. Be careful. Be careful with the way you treat yourself. Okay. So that's another thing, just like low carb can absolutely work for some people. And for a lot of people, you see really good like weight loss results right off the bat if you go low carb. But in the long term, especially if you don't consider the way that your lifestyle is, if you go low carb for too long, you can really create some hormone issues within yourself because you're not supporting your body in the systems that it needs. So like if you're an active person, if you're an active person who doesn't have like insulin sensitivity or diabetes, or you're having to deal with some sort of metabolic syndrome, that sort of person is somebody who would benefit from having more carbs in their diet, healthy carbs. And we'll talk about healthy carbs here in just a second. I'm not saying like, well, if you're active, you should just go eat all of the junk food. That's not what I'm saying at all. There is a huge difference between processed bull crap and healthy carbs in the way of like carbs. And like I said, carbs are not created either equally. So when I'm talking about healthy carbs by way of like whole grains and fruits and vegetables, that sort of stuff, as opposed to processed sugars and junk, like that. So if you are somebody who leads a fairly sedentary lifestyle, you probably don't need a whole lot of carbs because you're not using the energy pathways that require them. And if you're not using those pathways, all your body can do is store it as fat. If you're not using it, then it just stores it. We're fat storing machines. That's what we do. So if you lead a fairly active lifestyle, especially one, like if you lead an active lifestyle that has a lot of like powerful strength type moves, or if you work a job where you're lifting things all the time, that sort of thing, you would be a person who would benefit from a higher carb diet. If you lead a high stress life, you would be a person who would benefit from more carbs in your diet. If you lead a fairly sedentary lifestyle, you would be a person who would probably you wouldn't benefit as much from having a high carb diet, and you might see some weight gain if you consume too many. So let's see, I lost my place here. So let's talk about like healthy carbs though, because like I said, not all carbs are created equal. So we have to be a little bit careful here. When I'm talking about you would be benefiting from like a higher carb type diet, I don't mean junk, right? Like this is whole unprocessed type foods. Hey, like I said, a donut is not the same as broccoli. Not to say you can't ever help the donut, but that's not necessarily the type of carb that you need to ingest in order to fuel yourself well, right? Whereas the carbs found in fruits and vegetables, which are also packaged with fiber, which is fabulous for us, and other nutrients, whereas this is just pure energy. Donuts, pure energy, whereas apple has energy and also all these other things to support our systems. So when you're thinking about ingesting like healthy carbs are like fruits and grains and whole grains, not processed stuff like like the white rice. And white rice has had all of its nutrients stripped from it. It takes it out of its beautiful little like shell. Brown rice has that little shell on it, right? That brown rice has the nutrients still, and it has the protein still, and it has all of that lovely thing. And white rice is just the starch that's left over from after they stripped it off. Okay, so you don't necessarily want to go that way with whole grains. When I'm taking whole grains, I mean like whole oats, like steel cut oats or rolled oats, or brown rice, okay, like quinoa, okay, farro, these types of grains, whole grains, fruits and veggies with low glycemic indices. So I made a list here. Good carbs that you can consume safely if you're a person who lives a lifestyle that carbs would support are steel oats, quinoa, apples, cherries, strawberries, non-starchy vegetables like carrots and asparagus, broccoli, zucchini, squash, peas, beans, lentils, brown rice, milk, cheese, yogurts, coconut milks, cashews, peanuts. These are all like low glycemic foods that are carby, but that's not bad, right? So just trying to separate this idea that carbs are bad somehow, and trying to walk away from the idea that we need to exclude this entire food group from our lives is a little asinine. And like I said before, I'm really hoping that eventually we're going to turn the corner, just like we did with fats. Like I know we went through this decades worth of, oh no, low fat is the way to go and we shouldn't be eating fats. And now we look back on that and we recognize that that was a huge mistake, and forcing low fat across the country has only made matters so much worse. I'm really hoping that we see the same sort of like realization with carbs in general. And we need to make a very clear distinction between like healthy carbs and processed junk that really don't provide us with anything more than just pure energy. And if you're somebody who needs pure energy, right? If you're somebody who's go, and you need something to support that kind of lifestyle, then, you know, having the donuts, not a big deal, right? But if you're somebody who's not using that energy, right, then you need to make some choices here. Is it bad? No. But is it necessary every day? Probably not. So basically, carbs are not the enemy. We need to stop demonizing them. They are not essential. We know that, but they are helpful to lead an optimal, healthy life. You have to consider your current health state. So if you are not, you know, if you haven't developed insulin sensitivity, like if you're not battling type 2 diabetes, if you don't have, you know, signs of metabolic syndrome, then you can happily incorporate, you know, different levels of healthy carbs, and lead a very healthy life and optimal life. So you have to consider your own, you know, where you are now. You have to consider your lifestyle. You know, how do you move your body? If you move your body a lot with a lot of, you know, fast movements, then you're gonna want to introduce more carbs, especially to help you recover. So, you know, how's your health now? How are you moving your body, and what genetics like? Right? There's a lot of people who, for example, after a certain age can't process lactose anymore, right? They're lactose intolerant because they don't produce the enzyme lactase to break up those bonds like we were talking about. It makes people feel really, you know, bad. So maybe you're somebody who just genetically can't have things like dairy, right? So these are all things to consider, but to demonize the entire like field or the entire group of carbs is also not a healthy mindset either. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. I think it would be good for all of us to kind of sit back and do a little bit of like inner analysis. You know, how am I moving my body? What sort of energy pathway do I need? Am I more oxidative, so I'm fueling my energy with fat, so slower movements and more endurance? Or am I one who does a whole lot of like quick movements, and so I do need carbs to help support those types of energy systems and recovery too? And also know that healthy carbs can really help support your body in times of stress. Okay, so and that's psychological as well, because our bodies respond to stress in the same way, whether it's psychological or physical. So if you are going through a very stressful time, there is a reason why we get cravings, right? When we get stressed out and we're like, I just want ice cream. Your body needs some support right now. Okay, and that's okay to do that too. So if you're somebody who's living a very high stress life, you can help support your body by offering it some healthy carbs too. And just be a little bit more aware of, like, for example, sweet potatoes have so many great nutrients to them, and they have a lower glycemic index than things like white potatoes, right? So yeah, maybe have white potatoes on occasion and allow yourself sweet potatoes more often, right? These types of like recognitions and swaps to help support your body progress. Yeah, so don't demonize them. You can still have carbs, you can still have pizza, you can still have chocolate, you can still have donuts. Just do them in moderation and do them to support your energy needs. I know that was a little bit of a whirlwind as they seem to go. I'm going to see if I missed any questions over here. Are there any questions? Okay. As you know, I'm always happy to take questions. And if you're watching this later when it's not live and you have questions, please feel free to just send me a DM. I'm more than happy to address any of those questions. And if you're one who maybe not sure, if you're somebody who's leading a lifestyle that carbs can support, you know, ask questions of yourself, or you can even try to put out a profile to me and say, what do you think? I can tell you right now, for example, I do a lot of lifting. So I'm somebody who needs a little bit of a higher carb diet so that I can support my recovery. My husband doesn't do as much of that sort of movement, so he chooses to have a lower carb diet because he doesn't do these like fast movements and whatnot. All right, so we, like, even between my husband and I, we have different needs in terms of carbs, and it's just completely dependent on our lifestyles. So I don't see any questions over here on Facebook. So if that is the case, let's see. How come you can't hear me, but I can see Victoria? I see. Oh, Mom, because Victoria was on Zoom and you were on Facebook Live. So if you're on Zoom with me, I always post the Zoom links. So if you want to talk back with me, which I always appreciate, if anybody ever wants to join me in Zoom, I love talking to people on Zoom because then you're real people. But you can always click the Zoom link and then you would be able to talk back to me. But if you're just on Facebook watching Facebook Live, you can't talk to me. So that's why. All right. As always, feel free to reach out with questions, comments, or concerns. I'm more than happy to share my thoughts on whatever. And until next time, you guys eat more, eat well, and eat happy. Have a good night.